Hi, everybody. Welcome to our event on race, culture, and reggaeton. My name is Petra Rivera Rideau. I'm an associate professor of American Studies at Wellesley College in Massachusetts. And I wrote a book called Remixing Reggaeton, The Cultural Politics of Race in Puerto Rico. I don't want to talk too much about myself, but I just do want to say that I'm really excited to be doing this at Centro, which is a place that I sort of grew up with. My father is not an academic. He's a community activist from Lorain, Ohio, actually, but who was very integrated into Centro. And so as a kid in Connecticut, we would come to Centro to go to events, meet the researchers. And so it's really exciting to be part of this event. And it's really, really exciting to participate in an event about the history of reggaeton, a genre that I think is obviously incredibly impactful in our society, despite continuing to receive relatively little attention from academics. So what I'd like to do is begin by introducing our panelists. And then I have a few questions to get us going, the free-flowing conversation for a while. And then in the last 15 minutes, we'll have time for Q&A. And if you have any questions, it would be great if you can put them in the Q&A box. You click next to the interpretation box and you can submit your questions, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. Okay, so I'm going to introduce our panelists. First, we have Julio Pabón. He supervises creative at Spotify Studios, overseeing all original video, podcast, and audio exclusive offerings for the world's #1 audio streaming platform. Julio created and executive produced the critically acclaimed podcast Loud, The History of Reggaeton. And Julio and his team shaped the visual style and tone of Viva Latino, helping to make it the world's 3rd largest playlist with over 11.3 million monthly followers. Previously, Julio produced the hip-hop docuseries The Rapture and co-directed Afflicted, a controversial medical series centered on undiagnosable diseases for Netflix. And in 2014, Julio joined Vice Media, where he laid the groundwork to tell the first stories for the media outlet based out of Cuba, produced films with co-founder Surush Alvi and Shane Smith for Vice and HBO, and co-produced initial seasons of Vice, Guide to Contraband, Weedakit, and Vice World of Sports. And Julio received a Producers Guild of America Award for Best Sports Series for his episode titled Las Grandes Ligas for Vice World of Sports. Originally from the Bronx, he now lives in Los Angeles with his family. And next we have Omar Acosta, who was born in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and is a native of New York City, which set the stage for his art, which includes elements of graffiti and urban culture to be showcased in numerous venues. In 1993, he moved to Puerto Rico to polish his Spanish and continue his study of fine art, photography, and illustration at the Art League of Old San Juan. But growing weary of the quiet life of Puerto Rico, Omar was drawn back to New York, where he spent his time designing record packaging for an eclectic mix of local DJs and bands. In 2002, after having built a unique portfolio with clients such as MTV, Saatchi & Saatchi, and numerous others, he enrolled at Parsons School of Design with a merit-based scholarship to continue pursuing his artistic studies. And then upon completing his studies at Parsons, Omar was invited by MTV Latin America to become art director. And since then, he served as creative director for Yahoo and Microsoft, among others. And then finally, we have Katelina Eccleston, who created Reggaetón con la Gata, the first bilingual femme platform dedicated to bridging the gap between academia and the public by telling the intersectional history of reggaeton. Her platform led to her involvement in many high-profile and critically acclaimed projects, including the first podcast on reggaeton history, Perreo 101 by Reggaetón con la Gata, Spotify Studios and Futuro Studios Loud, hosted by Ivy Queen. She was born in Michigan and raised in Boston, Massachusetts, to Panamanian Jamaican parents. And she got her undergraduate degree at Marymount Manhattan Community College. Then she went on to graduate from the Pratt Institute of Art and Design and Marymount Manhattan College. With more than 7 years of digital video and audio podcast production experience, her work has been featured in Rolling Stone, Paper, the Los Angeles Times, and Harper's Bazaar, among others. And she's partnered with the likes of Telemundo, BuzzFeed, Refinery 29, Somos, and many others. So a round of applause for all of our panelists, infinitely cooler than I am. So I'm happy to be in your company. So I just wanted to start briefly, maybe Katelina, you can start us off by giving a little, reggaeton, like this is an auspicious day, right? The day Daddy Yankee released his last record, supposedly, right? And when I talk about reggaeton, a lot of people think of Daddy Yankee as the person who made it, right? With the release of Gasolina. But reggaeton actually has a very long history, and we don't have time to get into like all the details, but I'm wondering if you could give us sort of a kind of brief summary of what you think people need to know about the development of this genre. And then Julio and Omar, feel free also to jump in if you'd like.
Sure. First and foremost, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. And yes, I'll keep it short because there's a lot of details and we don't have the time. Con eso dicho, what can I say? It's as eloquently and beautifully as you've put it, Petra, in your work. I'm a huge fan. I'm fangirling here. That reggaeton is intelligent. Reggaeton is a medium of resistance, right? Reggaeton is joy. And it was used as a legacy of, how reggae pretty much manifested in Jamaica. That happened again in Panama as they were combating police brutality and brutality of dictators. And ese legado, it went on over into Puerto Rico. Specific figures, I would say, there's Los Cuatro Potencias with Renato, Reggae Sam, Gaby Menaito, and of course El General. And El General is pretty much the breakout star who pretty much put esta música urbana on the map internationally, doing hit-outs throughout Latin America. Puerto Ricans le dio su sazón, right? Using this music as a medium of resistance during the time of underground and Mano Dura contra el Crimen, as Marisol Lebron, shout out to her, eloquently puts in her research. That legacy pretty much continues on, and that is the spirit of this music, both in lyrically, también como se baila, how you dance it, because it's also resisting against white supremacy. It's powerful, it's beautiful, it's intelligent. Y to keep it short, eso es lo que.
That's awesome. Do you, Omar and Julio, anything to add?
I mean, I was in Puerto Rico when reggaeton started. We used to call it underground, and this was like '92 or something like that. And there were a couple of venues that we used to go to. We used to go to the Noise. There were the parties in the caseríos and the barrios, that sort of thing. And I coming from New York, I was deep into hip hop. And so when I moved to Puerto Rico, we had to move to Puerto Rico. It was very hard to find the hip hop that you could get albums, you could get like you could get like Rakim and that sort of thing. You go to the store and get albums, but if you wanted to go down the hip hop rabbit hole, it was extremely difficult. So we looked for mixtapes, right? And so you have local DJs like Playero and Negro, but Negro was mostly in his club in the Noise, which at the time was in La Perla, which is a barrio in Puerto Rico. So we used to go there. But Playero used to have this little red car, and you would stop him in the street. You see him and you automatically know that it was Playa. And you stop him in the street, and then you stop him and you just ask him for a mixtape, and he used to have them in the car. And I don't know, you pay $5 for them or something like that. And you didn't know what it had though. You never knew what it had. But it was always, it was, for me personally, it was a way to continue down the hip hop rabbit hole. And so I remember I stopped Playero once. I'll take a step back. We were listening to a lot of dancehall at the time. So the tape was either a dancehall tape or it was going to be a hip hop tape. We were listening to dancehall hard. When the Panama stuff started coming in, the Spanish reggae, we were into that. I fortunately knew Spanish, but we were into that my friends were into that because a lot of people in Puerto Rico didn't know Spanish. So now it's like the songs that we liked, the dancehall tracks that we liked, now we can understand them, right? So that was sort of like a pivotal moment, and that's sort of like why we gravitated to that music hard. I don't know what possessed Blaye to then get these kids from the hood to start recording. Actually, I have an idea I could tell you, but my point is that I remember I stopped Blaye once for a mixtape, and he gave it to me, and I walked away with like nothing, and so I remember going home that night and playing it, and it was Spanish. It was clearly a Puerto Rican over a dancehall track, but it was the same guy throughout the whole thing. I think I could be wrong, but I think it was like Big Boy or Frankie Boy or something like that. But I remember being like, what is this? What is? It didn't sound good. I was expecting hip hop, so I was expecting it to I was expecting my system to bump, and it was that. So that was my first introduction to reggaeton. It wasn't until 37, Playero 37, that and I remember vividly we were at a Mike Tyson fight, and somebody played, like, we were watching, it was a watch party type of thing. They used to in like the corner bodegas in Puerto Rico and the barrios, they used to put like a TV, and everybody sort of like, just hung around and watched it. And I remember somebody played it, and I was like, oh wow, like, okay, this came a long way in a very short amount of time. And there you could hear people like Yankee and all those guys. Of course, we didn't know who they were, because they were just kids from the hood, right? But what attracted it to it was our slang, right? Because I understood well the New York slang, Puerto Rican slang, if you will, because I lived it. But Puerto Rican slang is very different, right? And it's also very different than other sectors as well. So for us, it was our slang, and we understood it, and they called out little barrios, that it was very, very, very inside baseball, but for us, it was like, oh, they're shouting out they're shouting out, so it became ours. I mean, I could keep going and going. But that was my first introduction that's when I was like, okay, this is something powerful.
Yeah, that's such a cool story. And I love hearing the stories of sort of like the everyday encounters with this music. I think that's something that Loud, the podcast, does really well.
Very well, yeah.
Yes, and with the narration of Evie Queen, and adds this kind of, since as an artist who like Daddy Yankee, whose career has spanned all these decades, right?
Amazing,
really adds a lot.
Wait, just to go back to your original question, I think, Gata like pointed to it in her answer, but, reggaeton has always been about movement, and that movement, it literally like moved countries. And so I think when, you hear people say things like, oh, Daddy Yankee started it, I think it's because it went from Panama, it got to Puerto Rico's through Brooklyn, as you'll hear in the podcast, right? And other ways, but like, essentially it's always been about movement. So it even from its origins, like once it blew up, it's Panama, it's Black Panama specifically, right? And before that, Jamaica. And then it goes to Brooklyn, where it's like the Caribbean epicenter of the world. And then it makes its way to Puerto Rico. And then Puerto Rico's relationship with the United States makes it such that Daddy Yankee has the ability to blow up the way he does at the time that he does. And people are like, oh yeah, Daddy Yankee started reggaeton, but nothing could be further from the truth.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the periodization of Daddy Yankee, just like you mentioned, has to do a lot also with when record companies decided to invest in this music and put it forward, right? So like a lot of what Omar's talking about is sort of like mom and pop's homegrown thing, right?
There was also
the ability to travel back and forth freely,
right, exactly,
without a passport and spread that music.
Puerto Ricans, yeah. there was also, what became underground was also the we were listening to dancehall, house, and hip hop, and when it became underground was when all those three elements started merging, right? And then at some point Playa creates his own sound, right? And it was just a combination of the hip hop and the dancehall, and obviously that huge Panamanian influence. But at some point it goes from underground to reggaeton, and I think it has to do with the way the dembow was fine-tuned. And now we're going later on to like Looney Tunes and that sort of thing. But I think once that happened, it was like, okay, now we have a genre that's not only Puerto Rican, it belongs to Latin. It begins to us, right? As us as Latin people.
Yeah, that's. I definitely want to go back to that, but first I want to ask this question, since we're at Centro, right? The relationship between the Puerto Rican diaspora and Puerto Rico and the development of this music. And I think oftentimes, for example, my students are surprised to hear that various reggaeton singers spent a lot of time in the United States or were themselves people who moved back and forth. So, there are all these different layers of movement, but I didn't know if anybody wanted to comment on the role of the Puerto Rican diaspora in the development of reggaeton.
I think that Omar said it beautifully, that Puerto Ricans started seeing themselves in the music. That's why it was so important for us to, or at least we're pushing for Vicos's story on Viernes 13, because all of a sudden it's like, going through the hood and like, se puede identificar. Like, that's dope. And I completely got that. And yo lo encontré lindísimo. I was like, that needs to go there. Because it's nothing about, there's something about a representation that's extremely powerful. Y eso fue lo que era, to be able to see in Panama. That happened too, because, as you hear in episode 1 with Renato about, the xenophobia that he experienced, people were telling him like, habla bien, we don't know what you're saying, Spanish, and then that's what pretty much pushed him to rap in Spanish. Más so that he can get a bigger audience, of course, but also to combat the bullying that he was experiencing, that was part anti-Black, of course. So like, yes, definitely, no quiero hablar mucho porque no soy body de corazón, sí, but not, actual. I definitely understand that desire of like wanting to just see yourself, because hay tanto sazón ahí, you want to celebrate that, absolutely.
I also don't like piggybacking off that, because that is the absolute foundation, I think, for the sound and how it exploded on the island, and then by extension, how it exploded in the United States. We all have cousins like that go back and forth. We spend summers back and forth. Like, sounds travel, culture travels with that, and so I think that is not to be discounted, particularly as it grows here in the U.S. Right. I also think that the melting pot that is the East Coast, whether it was Massachusetts where Nicky Jam grew up, or whether it was New York City, there's always been, even though to Gata's like strong research suggests that like it's always been like underground, like no one talks about it. There's always been a strong, particularly Black, but like connection with like the Dominican Republic and Jamaica, right? And so I think the Puerto Rican diaspora, in a sense, like, feeds off of that, because they can flawlessly speak 2 languages, because that's the nature of our island, right? We are a colony, and therefore there is English. And so we have a little bit of that. And then we also have like that sazón that we added to a sound. And that sound is unique in that sound that is Boricua, but it's not the first time that like something was brought to the island and we added our toque to it, and then it became something else, right? And I think that's a manifestation of like, always traversing 2 cultures. And so this movement that is now reggaeton, like its expansion was like in large part because of that diaspora and the ability to mix and blend cultures. We can equally go to Latin America as we can to, the mainland US.
Yeah, I don't think, had it not been for that connection that we have with New York and that ability to go back and forth, I don't know that reggaeton would have blown up the way it did. Because like Julio pointed out, I spent summers in Puerto Rico. Every summer I spent summers in my grandmother's house. It wasn't a big deal to bring, I remember when people were rocking Converse in the late 80s, and you buy them, they would sell them in baskets in the corner in New York, for like $15. And I remember going back to Puerto Rico and people in Puerto Rico being like, "Oh, you got the Converse?" You know what I'm saying? So it was like now they're up on the Converse and they want to go back and forth with it was so seamless, that same way that stuff like that traveled, music traveled as well.
Yeah. So we've got, Jamaicans in Panama, and these multiple levels of migration. We have underground in Puerto Rico. And then Omar, a while back, you mentioned like Looney Tunes and kind of this moment where reggaeton sort of kind of explodes into the mainstream, for lack of a better word, right? And I'm interested in hearing more about that. And I'm so happy you brought up Looney Tunes, because I feel like they are so profoundly important in this story, and oftentimes they get left out. And also Massachusetts, right? They were in Massachusetts. So yeah, so what happens in the mid 2000s when things?
So I think before that we really have to talk about Velda.
Oh yeah, Velda. I'm sorry.
I think before that,
one of my favorite topics.
Yeah, before Looney, we have to talk about Velda, because Velda, reggaeton, like I said earlier, reggaeton was our slang, right? But it also dealt with a lot of the things that we were seeing, right, in Puerto Rico, right? And injustices and that sort of thing, and it was very raw, and that's why it was underground, because it was underground, right? We could we could say whatever we wanted, right? So with that comes the attention of Velda, which was a Puerto Rican senator. Now I have to point out that attention didn't happen until Puerto Rican rich kids started listening to reggaeton, right? Because all of a sudden it was like, okay, we gotta be clear about this, right? There's social classes in Puerto Rico, right? And it's very real, And so it wasn't until the lawyer's kid in Guaynabo and stuff like that started listening to reggaeton, that then the senators are going, wait, what's this poison that our kids are listening to, right? And so Velda goes on this crusade to sort of try to stop reggaeton. And during that, what ends up happening is that she's going hard, and what ends up happening is that she creates publicity, right? PR, right? And all of a sudden now, instead of reggaeton being like the metropolitan area of Puerto Rico, and Brooklyn and the Bronx around that time, now it becomes a national thing. Now it's like everybody knows about reggaeton. So all of a sudden, it goes from that to it goes from underground. Now it's like everybody kind of knows about it. So
let me chime in real quick, because that's a very important point. And the other, I would say, unintended consequence was that while during this time, and Gata can speak more to this, but during this time, there's also a lot of violent tension between labels, between artists, between groups, who's protected by who, what bichotes were connected with what artists. This is all happening simultaneously. And there are a lot of people like Looney Tunes who want to get in the business, who don't want to get shot. And so an unintended consequence of Velda was also that reggaeton, to be on the radio, needed to clean up. And so there was always going to be space for gangster reggaeton, but it was also now, okay, there's a path forward for everybody else that doesn't. And I think Looney Tunes was probably the most emblematic of that. So, kudos, agreed.
I just want to mention who Velda is, in case there are people listening who don't know who Velda is. So they're referring to Velda Gonzalez, who was a Puerto Rican senator who spearheaded something that she called the Anti-Pornography Campaign. And that campaign, which took place in 2002, was ostensibly to remove pornographic materials from the media writ large, but really targeted reggaeton music videos in particular. And it was an extended campaign that involved many hearings in the Puerto Rican Senate, anyone from like experts to youth testifying on the impact of reggaeton on their development and particularly their sexuality, because that was the primary concern, was the representation of women. So I just wanted to throw that out there in case people don't know who Velda is. It's Senator Velda Gonzalez. And Katelina, go ahead.
The only thing I have to add is, I know Velda gets like such a bad rep, but at the same time, there was like, I don't see her too much as a villain, because al final no se puede negar, you can't, go against the fact that there were women who were being sex trafficked. There was a large amount of femicide and domestic violence as well. So like, and we captured it cool, very nicely and loud with all the CDs that had to be thrown in the pool, because the FBI was literally on the way to Flaco Figueroa's house to go get the material to like use against him in court, because there was a lot of material in there with underage women, with not women, girls, girls who are in these videos. So al final, I understand that the people who are making this music, they were adults and they were like, feeling liberated in their sexuality, and I'm always for that. But al final no se puede abusar, because there were minors there, and you can't really go past that también. There's a line that can't be crossed. So.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point that we see in conversations today, right? How do we deal with sort of questions of misogyny and hypermasculinity in this music, and also support the music, and where do we make space for women? And I think the other thing Loud does really well is by having Evie Queen there, she as the host, she adds this kind of component, sort of reminding us of the constant contribution and participation of women, right, in this genre.
And you can't say, I mean, Evie Queen, Evie Queen deserves so much respect. We're talking about a time where it was, the lyrics were hard. This was Evie Queen was there during underground. Like, she wasn't there doing reggaeton. She had to fight her way through like the stage. I mean, we're talking about the only female amongst like, all these kids from, all these guys from barrios and caseríos of Puerto Rico. And if you guys are familiar with barrios, what a barrio and a caserío in Puerto Rico is, it's no Disney World, and not only did she make a name for herself, she sort of like se destacó, no? She came up, she came above, she went above and beyond.
I feel like there's so many things we can talk about, and I don't want to like skip over important things. But we also just have about 15 minutes left before we open it up. So maybe this is like a new can of worms, but I'm interested in hearing something that my students talk about quite a bit, which is the shift of this genre from something that was underground to something that's now very commercial, that is, one of the most lucrative music genres in the world. So a lot of my students are very interested in the sonic shift in the music, but also what are the social and cultural implications of this kind of mainstreaming of reggaeton that we're seeing now. So that's a big question, but.
Yes.
No, go ahead. Go.
Well,
All right, go ahead. I
want to say, I love that question, because it's kind of like a cycle that I've noticed happens in this music, right? Renato started rapping because he was tired of police brutality. He was like, oh my God, just let me exist. And so he created El Denny, and he literally came for the police in this track. And it went from this emotion of like anger that's justified and like hatred for the police to like celebration of Black women with Chica de los Ojos Café, you know, going over into canciones más sexuales with, you know, en general singing tu pum pum y cosas. So I went from like anger to like, you know, celebration of life and women to sex. And then that continues over into PR, which, you know, that's why I love reggaeton so much también. You know, that legacy, the manner in which it manifested in the island, you know, with underground being so, that time period being so violent because of mano dura, there was, you know, wanting to rebel, right? And then it went from that to like, you know, celebrating sex. Like, you know, we're tired of that, the heavy stuff. What about sex? We all love sex. And then, you know, it goes over into love. People are like, oh, it's too sexual. El romantiqueo. And then we kind of see how it like continues. I think that's like so dope. And that's pretty much the spirit of this music went up until a certain point. Ahora estamos en Yoribari. I don't know.
Omar, you want to?
Go ahead. Yeah, let's go.
Yeah, I just feel like you know, and the podcast sort of at the end sort of attested, like talks about this, but you know, sonically speaking, I think because it's a hodgepodge of sounds, it is universally accepted. I think you don't even have to know it's called reggaeton. I've been in like Stockholm, and like, you know, you people just can't help themselves. You just move, right? And so I think that will always create a relationship with reggaeton no matter who you are. I think in terms of its expansion and going pop, I think partly it was inevitable, partly the mass, you know, consumerist society that we live in like enables that and like shuts away like, you know, like a good chunk of people, women and Black people included, in the name of commercialization. So there's a lot of work still to do. But the fact that it is so universally renowned to the point where like for 2 years running, even without having an album coming out, Bad Bunny's the most streamed artist on Spotify. And, you know, he's, you know, at this point, you know, if we're talking politics and resistance, you know, you go through the years and like our, not less than 3 years ago, you know, the reggaeton artist toppled the governor of Puerto Rico. And so I think while there was always going to be consumerism, it will never cease to be a genre of protest.
Yeah, I think sonically, you know, now we could go to Looney Tunes, right? I think what Looney, you know, when you have people like Playa and Negro and these guys, they were still mixing sort of like, you know, records and creating a sound off of that, right? I think what Looney does, personally, I think what Looney does is they create their own sound, right? And that's a big deal. They develop sort of that dembow, and they also add, and for one of the first times, they bring in their own culture, right? You know, they bring in Dominican Republic, right? And they bring in bachata, right? Now they bring in bachata when nobody listened to bachata, you know, so that took guts, you know, and they bought in that bachata, and at that point it was like, oh, okay, like, you know, we could continue doing that. And I think that sort of opened the doors for other places like Colombia to then go, oh, word, okay, they're bringing in bachata, you know, a few years later, right? But they're bringing their bachata, they're bringing in their own sort of like instruments. We're going to do the same thing with our instruments, right? And I think that sort of starts to happen, and it continues to sort of like mix it even more. So I personally, I think that's sort of like the evolution of the sound.
Just really quick, I completely forgot, Julio, when you said sonically, I'm like, sí, la música, like, because I was thinking culturally, I'm like, wait, sonically, I just want to give flowers to DJ Blas, you know,
yes.
Yo, because that man, I've been able to, I talk with him frequently, but like, la primera vez, my curiosity was, mira, I realized that this music, apart from being sexually, lyrically, there's literally a parallel between the BPM and like Lo Movimiento. Was that on purpose? He's like, yes. He's like, I wanted to transport people from, you know, the nightclub to the bedroom, you know, like yo quería crear, you know, that type of like fantasy. And I thought that was dope because I know that reggaeton gets so much flack for being pornographic and stuff, but above all for the adults who can actually, you know, enjoy this music, you know, sanamente, like, I mean, for being of age and stuff. I thought that was clever. That was great, and that he made that music in this way. So I just wanted to give him the flowers.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I wanted to, there's a question, even though it's not Q&A yet, but a question about whitewashing and contemporary reggaeton, which is something that I was going to ask about next, given this kind of history that we have with the Black community in Jamaica and Panama and in Puerto Rico too, right? Like in the times of underground, like we were talking about barrios and caseríos, you're talking about working class people who are not necessarily exclusively Black, but where there's a large concentration of Black Puerto Ricans and Dominicans, right? So someone's asking about your thoughts on the whitewashing. I have a million thoughts on whitewashing, but I'll let you go first about sort of.
Gata, you want to take this one? You've been on a few of these panels. She's about to drop some knowledge on y'all, but go ahead.
I mean, it's just more so like, where do I even start? You know, this music was always de la gente, para la gente, and the moment that, you know, we started realizing that it can be lucrative, that's when a lot of questions started, you know, coming into play. Can we get this music without those people, you know? And so to speak, I will never, o sea, ¿cómo lo digo? Daddy Yankee is a star, I love him, you know, etc. But he was the perfect product, you know, so to speak. Barrio Fino was like a dream come true. As we said in Loud, like it inspired Spanish broadcasting systems to change 80 of their radio stations into puro reggaeton. That's a lot of faith, you know? So in which case, you know, there's like a desire to continue selling this product in this way with this type of singer behind this type of music. There was an increased desire to get away from, you know, the hood aesthetic. That's when we started seeing Blackness used sort of as like a gimmick, right? Whether it's through the fashion, whether it's through la jerga. And then as time goes on, even up until now, I say it all the time, I'm like, isn't that body? I start seeing super body jerga being associated to like, you know, other artists of other nationalities, because claro, there's like this sort of parallel in synonymity with Puerto Rican identity with reggaeton because of the amount of influence and like work that Puerto Ricans have put into the music. But at a certain point, you know, there started to be like a lack of questioning of who it is, you know, behind the mic celebrating this, right? There's this sort of like, you know, dichotomy of like culture versus nationalism and not being able to really give Blackness its flowers or like be able to identify how Black a lot of these elements are. It kind of like gets lost, and lost is too nice. It starts to get whitewashed, right? You know, we had on record that el reggaeton seco, that was a deliberate decision to be able to take the very African instruments out of the instrumentation of reggaeton. I'm in the studio now recording, and now I'm appreciating a lot more el proceso because I'm like, oh my God, el timbal, the drum, this is all very African. And the fact that people really thought to take this out on purpose, it was a deliberate decision is my point. And I understand the desire for commercialization, wanting to get the money in the bag. And at this point in time, there's like people who recognize, you know, with Reggaeton de la Mata, trying to create reggaeton que es más para la calle versus el popetón, como yo lo llamo, that's like very popular right now. What can I say? There's a lot to say. I feel like I touched on multiple things and there's so much more to say on that, pero ahí paro.
I think something that I like to really emphasize about this question too, is that this is also a problem of the Latin music industry more broadly. So we can see this with so many genres. Most Spanish Caribbean music comes from Black communities, right? So, you know, we can look back to Desi Arnaz in the 1940s, who was kind of whitewashing mambo, right? With his Babalu performances and then going on I Love Lucy. We see it with salsa. We see it with bachata. I mean, even Juan Luis Guerra, who I really do love. I mean, he was sort of a reluctant bachata singer, right? So I think that's also an important part that I like to emphasize is reggaeton in some ways is sort of the latest kind of victim of whitewashing in the Latin music industry. But I think we could really do well to put it in conversation with these other genres too, to show that this is really like a systemic pattern, not only in Puerto Rico or with Puerto Rican artists, but overall. And I was also thinking as you were talking about Tego Calderon, another person who we haven't yet mentioned, but when you're talking about instrumentation and drums and Daddy Yankee being the perfect product, and a little bit about the kind of juxtaposition of Tego Calderon and Daddy Yankee, both really responsible for mainstreaming this genre in different ways. And in my class, right before spring break, we listened to the podcast episode that talks about the two of them and the kind of development of reggaeton. But I wondered if any of you wanted to mention sort of the role of Tego in the development of this music and his importance. Because when we did listen to that podcast, one of the things that made me feel quite sad is that a lot of my students didn't know about Tego Calderon. And part of that is because they were in diapers when he came out. But part of it is like this systemic issue of whose legacy gets to be upheld and whose does not. So I'd love to talk a little bit about him and his importance in the genre.
Go ahead, Omar.
All right, cool. So that was extremely important for because we're talking. He breaks all the rules, right, from a marketing standpoint, right? When he blows up, they was older, right? He's not like this young pretty kid, right? That a record label wants to exploit, right, and get the longevity, right, from him, right? They was older, right? He comes from an area in Puerto Rico that's predominantly of African descent, right? So he's not even from the metropolitan area. That's where sort of the movement is going down, right? So he comes out of left field, right? And I say that to say it's pure talent, right? Like he blew up because it's pure talent, right? But Theo comes hard with a message as well, and he. Some people say, oh, they was rapping. He's not reggaeton or whatever. To me, he stood out personally. That's a different conversation. I'm not going to touch that. But to me, he stood out personally because he slowed it down and you could hear the message, right? So now it sort of became something. Now it sort of like took another turn that we're going, oh wait, no, we gotta listen to this. This guy's got something to say, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Dale, Julio, dale.
Well, just like the sonically speaking, he was doing things at a time that no one else was doing in reggaeton, and that's like giving true flowers to the like bomba roots, like the African roots, and like the real folkloric music of Puerto Rico. And you couple that with like very progressive lyrics, right? And he was getting cosigns from like your grandmother, because it wasn't dirty and it wasn't talking about like, women's panties, right? But he was also getting co-signed by like the academics, and young kids who were going to college. And he was also getting co-signed by the independentistas, because he was talking about, a very specific political view. And so he, in many ways, was a great unifier, and I'm so glad that now he's starting to reemerge in the conversation and getting in some of those flowers, because you really don't get, and in the podcast, we kind of allude to that when we pin in that episode Tego against Daddy Yankee, just to see the rise of both of them. But You know, the fact of the matter is that like, what you alluded to earlier is intentional. That erasure is intentional and systemic and historic. It's been going on forever. And reggaeton is not immune to that, particularly now that it's a $1 billion business. But sonically speaking, that's what he was doing intentionally. And then he was combining all these people on the island that, really weren't conversing, at that time.
I think what Tego did that was so beautiful is that he celebrated, he really tried to understand different elements of the African diaspora in different corners. He loved jazz. He incorporated that in his music. He loved salsa. You can hear it in Dominicana. I was mad at Tego at one point in time because I remember he said, lo que los panameños hace es puro reggae. And then after a point, he said, oh no, I start to understand the method to the madness. It's not just reggae. I get it. My bad. But the point is, he was celebrating Blackness in different corners and bringing it into his own, including with bomba, including with these other very African genres. And his as much as people love him, as fast as it feels that, he rose por la gente, he had a very difficult time también. And at first, him going to the studio, they were like, no, they didn't like the way that he rapped because it was so different. There was a type of xenophobia that he experienced because it was too Black, it was too foreign, it was too, we don't understand what you're saying. And después de un rato, started getting the confianza, the people started understanding what it is that he's all about. And lastly, what I'd say is, Tego ultimately, ay Dios, se me fue. But ultimately in the studio, him being in the studio, it wasn't an easy process. Once he started getting it, he started seeing not only how he can rise locally, but internationally también. And I thought that was beautiful, all while keeping his morals. Saying no to Diddy with Sean John, but celebrating on BET stage. And eso no fue fuera de normal because, Black is Black anywhere you go. So I thought that was beautiful with Tego. And that's definitely something, that's the most pro-Black example in reggaeton history, period, as far as the artistry of an artist goes.
Yeah, I agree with that. So we have some other questions here sort of on the theme of commercialization. But one I wanted to highlight is a question about misogyny and particularly misogynistic lyrics, and if your thoughts about that. So Katelina, you've mentioned the kind of, there is a place, right? Like for overt expressions of sexuality and things like that. And so this question of kind of how do you balance, or what do we make of, on the one hand, needing this kind of space, right? And I like to think about it too, like women have sexuality, right? Like, and so there has to be a space, right? But then how do you reconcile that with what, as you mentioned, are really like very misogynistic lyrics, right? And representations.
Yeah, definitely can't, deny the fact that it's a hyper macho space, it's majority men, etc. So that can never be thrown to the side. It has to be recognized. A la vez, there's a sort of reclamation that's happening by the women who choose to engage in these spaces. Jenny La Sexy Voz, Glory Glow, Dios, se me va el nombre, but like Shelly Mari Bebe, I believe are their names, who sang in Playero, in Underground. These women recognize, all of the power that comes with reclaiming their sexual liberation. So on one hand, it's like a two-way street. On one hand, women are being objectified. And on the other hand, what women are doing and how they're existing in a space don't necessarily have anything to do with the men, I saw someone tweet recently and I thought that was dope. They're like, sure, reggaeton is misogynist, but like, I'm not thinking about men when I'm moving my body. It's about me and like how I'm celebrating myself. And I think that that's dope. There's a power to be, recognizing that, as well as, the upside, the downside to that, with the hyper machista space of it all.
there's a lot of work to do. I I think in many ways, and this, you had alluded to this earlier, Petra, but I think in many ways, like reggaeton will always be, as is a lot of musical genres, a microcosm of society. And there's a lot of work to do in society. Like, you know, particularly, and I don't want to speak for all Latino America, but in Puerto Rico, the femicide has not gone away. And in Puerto Rico, the hate against trans hate has not gone away. And that's not the music, that's society. And so I think that we just have a lot of work to do. Sorry.
Yeah, I love that you said that though, because I think one time I was asked about Belda Gonzalez's campaign, like, did I see this as a feminist victory? And my answer was no, because the thing is that these are systemic societal issues. And so, you know, if people can clean up their reggaeton lyrics, we're still gonna have these problems. And also just like, I think it's really important for us to also recognize that other Latin music is not immune to this. So I feel like there's a lot of conversation about how in reggaeton, like there's no women, but there's also no women in banda, and there's no women in norteña, and there's no women in salsa, right? Reggaeton is, or, you know, these are also genres that are misogynistic, right? Too, in their own ways. And so I think, again, I'm not saying that that's not a conversation that we should have, but I think when we talk about reggaeton, we do really have to think about it in relation to these other things too. And that's really important. I wanted to ask Julio, I think maybe this question you can start with, but as we were talking about the evolution of the genre, Roberto Rosario asks about the impact of social media and streaming services on the development of reggaeton. And I was wondering if you could comment on that. That's a topic I'm personally also super interested in.
Sure. First, shout out to Roberto Rosario. That's my father-in-law, and he's like a fan. I love him. Thank you so much for asking questions and participating. You know, I think if you're looking at it from a holistic level, particularly in the United States, but you can also make this argument for Latino America. We're a younger demographic. We're connected in a way that other people like, and we've adapted in a way that other demographics just, you know, haven't to technology. And so I would say, like, from the emergence of YouTube, we were early adopters. We were throwing, Gasolina was on YouTube before MTV had a YouTube channel. And so we in doing so, I think we sort of cracked the code in many ways on branding, how to build ourselves. And you want to, like, I could talk all day on this, but let's fast forward. You know, reggaeton's now, you know, over 30, and social media has been around for about 20. So we're grown up. I've heard artists say things like, I don't need to go on tour anymore. Like, my brand is as big as my music. And I think that's a testament to the fact that we've always been ahead of the curve technologically. And we're not going to get credit for that just yet, but I do believe that to be true.
Yeah, and then again, I guess we have time for one more question. And so there's a couple of questions that are more specific, but generally what they're interested in is, what do you see as the future of this genre? Again, like I said, this auspicious day where Daddy Yankee says he's leaving us. So
don't believe the hype. There's a lot of money.
How many times did Jay-Z retire?
Somebody asked, as the people retire, right? Like the old people retire, and new people come up, or what do you see as the future? And I think this is an amazing question, because one thing we also didn't mention is, over time, people have been predicting the death of reggaeton since it started, right? It was going to end in 2000, then it was going to end in 2007, then it was, and so I'm really interested to hear what you all see. I don't think it's going to die, but what do you all see as the future of where we're going with this?
I don't think it's gonna die. I will never promote that. I think that, you know, I saw a meme, and I'm still very torn on how I feel about it. But it was basically like that Daddy Yankee passing the torch to Bad Bunny, and I'm like, oh my God. But at the same time, you know, he's doing a lot of things that has never been seen in this genre. I feel like there is a desire to really open up and like explore more of that, sensitive side. And he's doing it in a way that everybody can relate to, even men. Men are so, vulnerable and like sensitive now, and I'm over here like, what is going on? You're excited about puteria, like how are we gay here? Everybody's in their feelings. But with that said, I feel like we're in a time culturally where like everybody's looking for that and trying to connect with each other more, because we've never been more connected yet disconnected, right? There's this collective fear of cancel culture and, the pressure of saying the right thing all the time, which I don't find to be human at all. And I feel like, there's a sort of vulnerability that's coming with this. So I feel like the future of this music comes with people who are about very social themes that people can relate to and can open up conversations. I love Vegana, the fact that she exists and is rising and is being recognized for her talent, and people aren't making it about every other aspect of her, which is beautiful, but her talent, which at the end is what matters, puede rapear o no, yes. I think that there's a lot of doors to be open, a lot of conversation that still need to be had, but I think we're shifting in a direction that's a lot more open than the past, at least to say.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think it's going anywhere. People have been killing reggaeton for since it started, and now you have groups in Istanbul who are you have groups all over the world who are killing it. So if anything, the nature of reggaeton was always sort of like this melting pot of sounds, right? And so now, I think what you see happening is everybody bringing in their own sounds, from wherever they're from, right? And who knows what that's going to lead to. So I think reggaeton is here to stay.
Once you go pop, you don't go back. And so I think what I see a world where it is so ubiquitous that you can go to Argentina and hear of what they think is a reggaeton, and it is, because that's reggaeton to them, right. And it is completely different than any other reggaeton you'll hear anywhere else in the world. And so I think it's just going to be everywhere at all times. And world.
Just to add to that, the interesting thing about reggaeton is that nobody's going, this is reggaeton Argentina, this is Argentinian reggaeton, this is Colombian reggaeton, this is reggaeton. That's it, right? So it's it's become something that's ours.
That's it. I think that's great, and I totally agree with everything you're saying. And I just like to think about also, like, it is so pop, and it's not just Latin pop, right? It's also in our American pop music.
There's a there was a time where like reggaetoneros would beg hip hop artists and pop artists to be featured on their tracks, right. And now you've got Ed Sheeran begging reggaetoneros to be on his track, right? And right. So sky's the limit.
Yeah, for sure. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, I think. And so, Angel, are you closing us out?
I am. Thank you very much for everyone for being here. Thank you for being at this afternoon Tertulia at Centro. 1 hour is not enough to talk about race, gender, music, reggaeton, diaspora, but we're really, really grateful to our panelists and to Petra. As someone said in the comments, that we were among icons. So thank you very much for everything that you have done. We really enjoyed the conversation, and stay tuned for our next events.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, same.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
It was amazing. Thank you.